I need you to give an even bigger round of applause to Piper Kerman, everybody. Give it up for her.
That's a tough act to follow. Thank you very much, Gil, for that beautiful introduction and that amazing performance. Thank you for sharing your words with us. You know, security, no substitute for courage. Like, that's an idea I'm gonna carry with me, right? Okay, here I am at the inaugural San Diego Writers Festival. I'm so happy to be here with you. So exciting, this new beginning. This beginning is really great. But I have so many things that I want to talk about with you, so I'm going to get started. Orange is the New Black, my year in a women's prison. Let's go. For those of you who are writers, I know many of you are writers, some of you are readers, some of you are both. I tell my students, if you want to be a writer, you better be a reader, right? So every person who's ever sat down to try to compose some version of a story, whether it's a poem or a true story or fiction, is like, well, what is the story? Where's the beginning, the middle, and the end of this story? So when I think about the reason I'm up here with you, the story starts way, way back in 1992, and that's the year that I walked in my college graduation. When I think about this story beginning. I grew up in a very ordinary middle-class family in Massachusetts, where I was raised. Both of my parents were teachers. I was lucky, raised in a safe and stable home. And then I got to go to this place, which is a small women's college in western Massachusetts, Smith College. Yeah, I know we've got some Smithies in the audience, always. This, of course, is the first women's institution in which I was held. And I was lucky to be there, right? Because it's an amazing institution. It's an institution which exists only to provide women with the education that they need and they want, with the confidence that they need and they want, the connections, a sense of purpose to go out into the world and change the world in whatever way they think is important. And it's a remarkable community of women, and I was lucky to be there. Now, despite all of this good fortune that I just described to you, I still walked into a somewhat uncertain future when I walked in that college graduation in 1992. And that's because I really did not have a clue what my next move was. I was not, a star student. I was, the student who I'm like, okay, let's get over the finish line here. And that chapter of my life was over, right? That's my formal education. The page had turned. And I wasn't really prepared. I was well prepared sort of, intellectually, but like planning-wise, not so much. I had other friends who were more organized or more goal-oriented than I was, and they went off to graduate school or an internship. I actually had a couple friends who had like a job that paid you money. And I drifted. I dog paddled. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing now. I stayed in Northampton. I was that kid who sort of hangs around after graduation. And I did get a job. I got a job waiting tables at a microbrewery in town, and I was like, okay, I gotta figure things out now. That's the moment in time when my path crossed with what I thought was a very worldly and sophisticated older woman. And she turned out to be even more sophisticated than I understood initially because she was involved with narcotics. And when I discovered that, rather than run in the other direction, as perhaps self-preservation would suggest you do, I instead followed her around the globe to places like Bali and Zurich, places that seemed unimaginably exciting and exotic to, a fairly sheltered 22-year-old. I'd never been out of the United States before. And I think I imagined that by following her, I would find a great adventure. But of course, what I found really quickly, I found myself in way over my head. I found myself in a situation that I did not know how to navigate. I think I also imagined that I could somehow be around the stuff that she was involved in and yet hold myself apart. But of course, the day came when my lover said to me, I need you to do something. I need you to carry this bag of money from Chicago to Brussels. And she did not say, hey, does that sound like fun? She said, I really need you to do this. And she was scared. I could tell that she was scared. So I was scared. And I did it. I carried that bag of money from Chicago to Brussels. And after I did that, I was even more scared because I understood that I had crossed a line that I could not uncross. I had committed this irrevocable act that sort of pushed my life to a whole different paradigm. This is when the self-preservation finally kicked in. And I was very, very lucky because I was able to safely leave that relationship, which is not true for all women. It's not true for all people who are in those kinds of harmful situations and relationships. But I was able to leave that relationship. I was able to make my way back to the United States, out here to California, actually, where I had friends from college, women who cared a lot about me, knew me well, knew the person I was in all my complexity. And my friends helped me. And I needed help, right? I needed help getting my feet on the ground, getting my head back together because I was kind of a mess. And that's what happened. I got the help that I needed, and my life moved forward. I got a good job. And every year that passed, that crazy experience seemed to recede a little bit in the rearview mirror. But what they say about karma is true. And the consequences of our actions do come back to us in one form or another, right? And in my case, it was the knock on the door. It was really the doorbell. It was the doorbell. It was the doorbell of the apartment that I had moved into literally weeks before with my then boyfriend, Larry. And the world was our oyster. We had just moved to New York City, like one of the most exciting cities in the world. And we both had really interesting new jobs. Like the world was our oyster. And that's when 2 federal agents rang my doorbell and let me know that I had been indicted in federal court in Chicago, and I would be taken into custody if I did not report for my own arraignment. And this began my journey through a part of the American criminal justice system, a system that ironically I knew very little about. I really do recommend, if any of you have any like big transgressive moves cooking, do understand the sanctions that you might face. That would be my recommendation. I was about to get a very, very steep learning curve on mandatory minimum sentencing and the federal drug weight guidelines that would be used for that sentencing and a whole host of things about the criminal legal system that I knew nothing about. And ultimately, I was headed into the biggest prison population in the world by far. We have 5% of the world's people here in the United States, but we hold about 25% of the world's prisoners. And when it comes to women, fully 1/3 of all incarcerated women are held in American prisons and jails. And that's where I was headed, right? And I was scared. Of course I was scared, because our ideas and our images about prisons and prisoners, certainly every TV show you've ever seen, for the most part, all of the stories that tend to gain credence in our society tend to depict just uncontrollably violent people filling up uncontrollably violent places. So of course I was scared. Now, a strange twist of fate meant that it was, the years passed. There was a strange legal delay. And it was actually a chilly February morning in 2004 when Larry drove me here to this place. This is the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. And I looked at that vicious triple-layer razor wire fence that you can see there, and I squeaked out, I thought this was a minimum security prison. And I'll tell you something about that fence. You go through it completely alone. It is triple layer, so there are 3 gates. And a correctional officer escorts you to the outside gates and another correctional officer awaits you on the inside gate, but you go through it completely alone. And as each gate clanged shut behind me and I was surrounded by chain link fence and razor wire going up as high as I could see, I was scared. Now, the two correctional officers who transformed me from Piper Kerman into 111-87424 did not do a lot to make me less scared. Go figure. And then I was put into Gen Pop, into the general population, into the unit where I would serve out my mercifully short 15-month sentence. I turned up on that February morning, and more than a decade had passed since I had committed the crime that I was now going to be held accountable for. So they put me into Gen Pop, and I was surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of other women, and I knew none of them. But I saw right away that I was wearing a uniform that was different than what they were wearing. And on my feet were these little canvas slippers that the correctional officers had given me. And on the other women's feet were these big, black, steel-toed shoes. And women began to approach me in their big, black, steel-toed shoes, and I was scared. And they said things to me like, "Do you need some toothpaste? Do you need some shower shoes? Because there is a wicked foot fungus in there. Do you need me to make you a cup of instant coffee? Because, Kerman, you are quaking in your slippers. Look, today is a really bad day. Tomorrow will be a tiny bit better." That's what one woman said to me. And what I was experiencing was something that I would then witness hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of that year I spent in prison. And that was this phenomenon of the welcome wagon, where there would be a new prisoner on the unit and other women would step up and make sure she had those very basic things you need to survive your first few days and weeks in prison. Because the Federal Bureau of Prisons does not give you soap for your body or shampoo for your hair or toothpaste or a stamp to write your family and let them know that maybe you're sort of okay. You must be able to buy those things from the commissary. And when you're new, you can't do that. Most people in prison come from our poorest and most vulnerable communities and families. So affording those things is hard for lots of people. But even for someone like myself, more lucky, more fortunate, you can't do that when you're new. You are completely reliant on the kindness of strangers. And the last thing I expected on my first day in prison was to experience kindness at the hands of the other women, and yet that's exactly what happened. So I went to bed that night, I crawled into my top bunk, my bottom bunkie snored like you wouldn't believe, and I was exhausted. I was bone tired and very overwhelmed, and I will confess that I was wondering, what do I have to do for that toothpaste? And the answer is nothing. You know what? Just when you do get commissary, buy a tube of toothpaste, return it to the woman who gave it to you. But she might not take it back, in which case you pay it forward and you give it to a woman who comes in behind you who needs it. I crawled into that top bunk, though, and I recognized, even that very first night in prison, this experience is not going to be what I expected or anticipated. And I resolved to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut, which is the advice I would give to anyone unfortunate enough to be heading to prison or jail, and also to many writers, right? So there I am, 111-87424, not looking my best, and rarely is anyone looking their best in their mugshot or their prison ID, right? Because those are bad days. Now, what you see above it, that scripty fancy thing, that was made for me by Star. So Star was my neighbor, and when I say that, I mean she lived about 3 inches away from me in the top bunk right next to me. Star was sort of the resident artist of the unit where I lived. She loved to draw. Young woman in her early 20s, very talented illustrator, loved to draw all kinds of things. She would draw an elaborate birthday card on a big manila folder that a woman could send home to one of her kids on the outside, this small gesture for a mother to be able to make to her kid when they're separated. She would make you a tattoo design. Now, no one was shooting tattoos in that unit at that time, but I guess if you really wanted a souvenir of your time at Danbury, you could bring it home and get it done out there. One of the other things she would make were these. So we were required to have our name and our prisoner number on our bunks when we were counted multiple times during the day by the correctional officers. So rather than just scribble out rudimentary name tags, Starr would make these scripty, fancy, feminine, twinkly, and each and every name tag she made was a little different. Every name tag was unique. And to me, this was a powerful signal of welcome. It was like, hey, we know that you are not just 111-87424. We know that you are Kerman. Usually, at least to my face, they called me Piper. We know that you are a woman. We know that you are one of us now. And for those of you who are straining to see it, I know it's a little fuzzy, that is a kitten sticker. I did not see that coming. And by that, I do not mean to suggest for one moment that American prisons and jails are nice places to live. Just show of hands, who here has ever visited a prison or a jail? Some of you, yeah, not so nice, right? American prisons and jails, by design and by intention, are very harsh and difficult places to live. They are literally built that way, and they are operated that way to be places of scarcity and of struggle. That is part of the American philosophy of punishment, right? And of what we think a prison is meant for. So if you're worried about whether American prisons and jails are harsh enough, you can check that box. And yet, kitten sticker. So I spent 11 months in that prison in Danbury, Connecticut. And the women that I met there schooled me, and some of them befriended me, and they helped me survive in ways both incredibly ordinary and everyday, and also in some of the most important life-saving ways that I can even think about. And they shared their own survival with me, and I am eternally grateful to those women, even the ones I didn't get along with, because I left that prison a very different person in many different ways. And that was not because of the cage, it was because of the people I was with inside that cage, right? Now, after 11 months in prison, maybe I got a little overconfident. You know, I had a good bunkie. I had managed to make some friends. I had escaped a bad prison job for a better prison job. And I had, you know, mastered sort of the prison rules, which don't always apply, and some intel on when and where that would happen and why. And more importantly, or equally importantly, I had also mastered some of the prisoner rules, right? The prison has its rules, the prisoners have their own rules. They're equally important if you want to prevail or survive, or minimum survive. So, you know, after 11 months, you know, I was like, I think I kind of got this, which is, you know, a ridiculous thing to say for anyone who's actually had to do serious time. But that is the moment when I found myself transported out of that prison onto something called the Federal Airlift. And the Federal Airlift is the super secret transport system that the federal government uses to move its heavily tattooed human cargo from one prison to another. And there are a lot of federal prisons in this country. And what you see on those jumbo jet airliners are hundreds and hundreds of men and a small handful of women, you know, from every age group, from many different walks of life, vastly disproportionately brown and black people. And what you hear on those jumbo jet airliners is the rattling of chains, because each and every one of us was heavily shackled, right? So I was being taken to this place, this strange triangular high-rise. Do we have any natives of Chicago in the house? Of course we do. There you are in the back, ma'am. There's always a Smithy, and there's always someone from Chicago, no matter where I go. I love it. This is 26 stories high. It sits right downtown in the Loop. and it holds about 700 men and roughly 35 women. The women are locked on the 12th floor and essentially forgotten about. This is the federal jail in Chicago, Illinois. And at that point, this was the worst place I had ever been in my life. Since then, I have visited some other prisons and jails where the conditions are worse. But for me, at that time, I was plunged into this new situation, and it was quite different than the minimum security prison camp where I had done those previous 11 months. And as I struggled to survive in this sort of new situation, what was ringing through my head were the words of a woman who I had become very close with back in Danbury. This, of course, was the formidable prisoner who ran the kitchen with an iron fist. And she and I were really close. And she had done a lot of time, and she had been in a lot of different prisons. And sometimes she used to lean back and go, "Oh, you girls, you don't know what real prison is." And what she meant was a facility like this. And I think the reason that that's important to know is because the conditions here in this federal jail were much more typical to what most prisoners in this country experience in state prisons, in city jails, in county jails, those kinds of facilities where the vast majority of our incarcerated people are. And it was really brought home to me during my 6 weeks in this triangular high-rise what a powerful effect the conditions of confinement will have on a person emotionally, intellectually, and physically, because it is only here in those very last weeks of my incarceration that I began to lose hope. That's how powerful the conditions of confinement are, right? And I want people to know that when we think about what our prisons and jails are really like and what kind of shape we want people to come out of them and back to the community, right? We want them to be not a wreck, right? Boy, was I glad to get out of there. This is the cliff notes of the cliff notes of this book, right? Orange is the New Black, my year in a women's prison. I came home from prison in 2005, and almost to the last man and woman that I knew, people wanted to know about the experience in as much detail as I was willing to share. So it was more efficient to write a book. No. Many people that I knew in my very, what I thought of as ordinary middle-class life, did not have personal lived experience with the American criminal punishment system. Although, what I found, even right from the jump, is that when you peel back the curtain, more and more people would say to me, well, actually, I have an uncle. I have a cousin. Actually, my brother, is addicted to drugs and has been in and out of jail. When you build the biggest carceral state in human history, it turns out that it affects a lot more people than we necessarily realize. I hoped that by writing the book, that first of all, a reader would come away with a different idea about who is in prison in this country, right? For one thing, we don't always think of women first. And why are they there? Why do we lock so many of our own people away? Why do we isolate them? Why do we banish them from the community? That's what a prisoner of jail is, right? An exile, a banishment. What are the things that, why do people really land in jail, right? Both the pathways and also literally the offenses. And what is it like to live your life day to day behind the wire? I hoped to bring the reader into that experience. In essence, the book is an invitation to the reader to stand in my shoes as sort of the narrator or protagonist of the book, or in the shoes of one of the other women who is depicted in the book, because fundamentally the book is about another remarkable community of women, right? And, that's a big ask for readers. We don't necessarily leap to empathize with or identify with the millions, 2.3 million people incarcerated right now, people who we describe as criminals, as convicts, as felons. We have a lot of different words that we use to label both the people who are incarcerated now or the even millions more who might have been in prison or jail at some point, right? So I knew that that was a big ask for the reader, to imagine themselves as that protagonist who is doing their protagonist thing behind the wires of a prisoner in jail. I hoped also that if I told the story what I thought was the right way, in sort of a pop culture way, that maybe someone would pick up a book about prison who would not otherwise read a book about prison. And I thought that was really important. I think that if we're going to have the biggest prison population in human history, more Americans should know that, should inform themselves about it, should think about it, and should debate whether they think that that really serves us as a community, as a society, as a nation, right? Now, people ask about the title. Orange is the New Black, and all the writers in here are like, oh yeah, titles, that's the hardest thing. Orange is the New Black, what does that mean? Well, I hope it's obvious that it is a sarcastic joke about the notorious orange jumpsuit, the idea that that particular garment could fit into the fashion cliche is a joke, but it is also intended to signal, hey, this is not just a book about prison, this is a book about women, right? This is a book about a remarkable community of women, the remarkable resilience of women, and it has another meaning. So Orange is the New Black, means that, first of all, book about women, and it also has to do with this number, 650%. Does anyone know what 650% is? This is the conservative estimate of, oh, whoa, sorry. I don't know what I did. Oh, there we go, sorry. 650% is the conservative estimate about the rate of increase in the incarceration rate for women in this country over the last 30 to 40 years, right? And by comparison, the rate of increase for men during the same time period was 400%, which is still a big number. But 650%, I know some of you are like, wow, you're racking your brains. This female crime wave, how did I miss it? Right, you didn't miss it. There has not been a female crime wave. In fact, I think, when we think about what is the intention of our writing, what do we have to reveal to our readers or our listeners? One of the things that I think is so important about the story contained in this book and the adaptation to the Netflix series is this. When we look at women and girls in the criminal punishment system, what we see is the most ordinary, everyday example of the American attachment to harsh punishment. And when we think about harsh punishment, we might think about the death penalty, right? The ultimate penalty. We might think about the fact that we are the only nation in the world that sentences children to die in prison. We're the only nation in the world with juvenile life without parole sentences. But when we look at women and girls in the system, it's a little bit of a different picture because 2/3 of incarcerated women and girls are there for a drug offense or a property crime, something like fraud, and not for the most serious violent offenses that most concern us, though some women are there for those offenses, but the majority of women are not. And many of the offenses that we lock women and girls up for are very low level. That was true in federal prison where the sentences are particularly harsh. That is true if you go to the county jail here or the city jail here or to the state prisons, right? So I think that understanding the impact of harsh punishment on Americans, on families, on children, it really demands attention paid to the situation of women and girls in the system. And the person wearing that orange jumpsuit is more likely than ever to be a woman. So hence, orange is the new black, right? So who are these women we keep locking up hand over fist? They are women like Carmen and Marietta, pictured there with her daughter, and there's Betty with her boys. These are women that I know from the Women's Prison Association based in New York where I used to live. And the Women's Prison Association has been around since the 1840s, right? Serving criminal justice involved women and their families. And providing housing has always been a really important part of what we do. And one of the things that are still there in the main office are these log books going back to like the 1860s. And you open them up, and the first thing you notice is the handwriting. The penmanship is unbelievable. It is beautiful. And the next thing you notice is that all the names are Irish, every one. And it's a powerful reminder, I think, that prisons and jails are tools of social control that have never been equally directed towards all members of the community based on simply their actions in the community, but rather are these tools of social control always focused on a certain segment of the population that people in power who operate prisons and jails think are the people who need to be controlled. So in New York State, if you look at the prison rolls now, you will not see necessarily a lot of Irish names, but what you will see if you go to the state prison and see who's locked up, you'll see vastly disproportionately people of color, women of color, girls of color, right? So there are many reasons to care about all of the people who are walking in, and almost all of them are going to walk out of our prisons and jails, and all of the folks who it affects, their children, their families, the communities in which people live, right? But racial justice is one of the most powerful. That's one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be here with you at the San Diego Writers Festival, because there's such a significant lens of making sure that a wide diversity of voices are included and that we hear from everybody within the community and not just some people, not just the people who are powerful. So, I've been throwing some statistics at you. I know, I'm not sure if you were anticipating that. When I think about these stats and these issues and these questions that confront us as a community, as a nation, I think about stories. That's me. I'm a storyteller. Just I'm not even by nature, by training, by everything. I think about real people. I think about people I did time with, and other real people who have crossed my path since then, of course. I think about people like Pom Pom. So Pom Pom was another young woman who lived in B dorm with me. If Star lived right there, Pom Pom lived right there. Now, one thing you need to know about prison is that everybody gets a nickname. As Pom Pom discovered, you are just one experimental hairdo away from a nickname that follows you for your whole prison bid. So Pom Pom was a shy, quiet young woman. I got to know her not because I lived a couple feet away from her, but because she worked in the garage, and I worked as an electrician, but I was also the driver of the electric van. Us minimum security prisoners, it was our job to maintain the entire 400-acre prison facility, like the whole plantation. So every single day, I went down to the garage. I had my prison license. It's very hard to get. Not hard to get. It's easy to get. But I went down to the garage every day to get that van. I get the keys to the van, and they gas you. The gals who work there, they gas you up. They fix your windshield wipers. You shoot the breeze. It's fantastic. Pom Pom was shy, though. She was quiet. So I was surprised one day. I was standing in line in the chow hall waiting for lunch, and Pom Pom was standing next to me. And she just started talking. And I was like, what is up with Pom Pom? And she said, boss called me into his office today, meaning the correctional officer who supervised her in the garage. I was like, okay, that can't be good. What did he want? She said, well, he wanted to know if I ever had any family here. And I was like, okay, that's not a crazy question. We have 2 sets of sisters locked up with us right now, if you can imagine doing time with your sibling. What about it, Pom Pom? Did you ever have family here? She said, yeah, he asked me too if I ever had a sister here. And I told him that he must be thinking about my mom, because I heard that she was here once. Something about the way she said that made me ask, where's your mom now, Pom Pom? And she said, I have no idea. Pom Pom's mom was addicted to drugs and had been in and out of her life, more out than in, for her whole life. And on that day, Pom Pom found herself not only incarcerated in the same prison that had held her mother, but working in the same job in the garage, working for the same guy. And she asked her boss, "What was my mother like when she was here? I would like to know more about her." And he said, "She never gave me any trouble." And then he asked Pom Pom why she was there. And I always wondered about that question. I felt like he should know the answer to that. So Pom Pom went home before I went home. I was due to be released to a halfway house in January, and Pom Pom was released in November. And she went home to New Jersey. She went home to one of the poorest parts of New Jersey. And right before Christmas, I got a letter from Pom Pom. Very sweet letter. Now, it might surprise you to hear that most people are scared before they get released from prison. You remember how scared I was to go to prison? Well, even someone like myself, for whom, I have a lot more stability and good fortune for that difficult journey home, it still looms large as a frightening transition, right? Your identity as a prisoner is not one that you want, but it is one that you had better adapt and adopt if you want to survive in prison. And for most people coming home from prison or jail, they are coming home to situations very similar to the situations that contributed to them being incarcerated in the first place. So that challenging, scary transition looms large for almost everyone, even though everyone wants their freedom. Don't get it twisted, right? So in her letter, Pom Pom said, "Hey, Piper, you did the time. You didn't let the time do you. So just keep your head down, don't let anybody mess with you, and you will be home before you know it." It was a very sweet letter. And then she said a little bit about what was going on with her. So Pom Pom had gone home to New Jersey, and she said that she was sleeping on the floor of a relative who didn't really want her there. She didn't go out of the apartment that much because it was dangerous, and sometimes there were gunshots. And also it was cold, and she did not have a coat. Thanksgiving had just come and gone, and there had been no Thanksgiving dinner for Pom Pom. And she said in her letter, "I really miss you guys. I feel like you are my real family." And I read that letter sitting on my top bunk after mail call, and I cried. And they were mixed up tears because there were powerful and conflicting emotions behind them. I was scared for Pom Pom and for her safety and for her future. The future that I felt like she deserved, a better future. And I knew that that was in no way guaranteed as I read that letter. And I was also angry. I was really angry as I read that letter. The idea that all this money spent on incarcerating, generations of families, all of this waste of our human capital, in order to have a world where a young woman might feel safer and more loved behind the walls of a prison than home in the free world, that made me very angry. I wanted someone who read that book to come away from it caring as much about Pom Pom and her future, or any other number of the women who are depicted in the book, as I did when I read that letter. That was the task that I set to myself as a writer who had never written anything for publication before. I got love and support and encouragement to write the book. It was, a stumbling process, but I felt like it was important. It was important for people to know how important people like Pom Pom are, and all the other women who were there, even the ones I didn't get along with. That was a task I set to myself as a writer. I hoped desperately, when the book was finished, that it would find readers, someone other than my mother-in-law's book club. I must tell you something. Those ladies asked me more questions than the US attorney did. Okay? I think that book clubs are an overlooked investigatory tool. I think I'm going to call Jeff Sessions about this one. I don't think he has got very much on his hands right now. Yeah, So I was very grateful that the book did find readers, and it found one remarkable reader in the person of Jenji Kohan, who, you may know is this Hollywood mocker, and she did the show Weeds, and interestingly, she wrote on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air a million years ago. So the book was published in 2010. I was so grateful that it did find readers. I was lucky that the Random House sent me on a book tour. I was like, oh my God, I get to go on a book tour. And I went to Los Angeles for my book tour, and it was arranged that Jenji and I would have lunch. And it was a long, long lunch because Jenji had roughly 2,472 questions for me. And this is on top of a careful reading of the book, right? And those questions were everything from, what kind of mind games do you play with yourself when you are facing the desert of your sentence and you have no idea how you're going to cross it? I was like, okay, let me think about that one for a minute. She was like, wait. Is there cheese? Is there cheese? Very worried about whether there was cheese in prison. At the end of that long lunch, she said, I would really like to do this as my next project. And I was like, that is bananas. And so here I stand before you. In February, we wrapped the 7th and the final season of the show, and excited we are. How they feel about it. But any writer, even if you're a novelist, it's still your baby, right? And you're turning it over to be essentially torn apart and put back together again as some sort of strange Frankenstein monster. But I feel very grateful and very fortunate that such creative, intelligent people were attracted together to work on that adaptation. And I always say that Jenji takes the book and she puts it in the blender, and she puts a lot of other ingredients in there, and she presses liquefy. And, obviously for me, as a very singular viewer, that's a fascinating thing to see. I'm going to show you a clip from the very first season of the very, very first episode. But it's fascinating to see the ways that she uses the material from the book in ways that I would not have imagined, in creative ways, in ways that are truly adaptive. So for anyone who's read the book, there's a very important scene by a lake. And for anyone who's a fan of the show, they know that the lake plays this very significant role in season 3. And from my point of view, they afford the same symbolism, even though the narrative is different, right? I'm going to show you a clip from that very first episode, very first season, and I'll tell you why after we watch it. Woo! Oh, might not be going. No, I don't think it's going. That's okay. Uh-oh, we might be stuck though. So, yeah. The process is interesting. And so there are some things in the show which are, in some cases, like the scene I was going to show you, word for word from the book. But that's unusual. Those adaptations, like the example with the lake, are much more frequent. The best thing about the adaptation, I think, the reason why we have gained a passionate fan following for 7 seasons, is because she made a really important creative choice. And that is this choice around this idea of protagonist, right? So the thing that the book asks the reader to do is to accept a prisoner, a criminal, a convict, a felon as the protagonist, and to get, as I say in my class, I'm like, you need to get them on your train, right? The story you're telling, on some level, you're asking the reader to come and ride the train with you for a while, ride with you as the protagonist, right? So that's what the book asks you to do. And the show, and the brilliance of that adaptation, is that she took that idea and she just broke it into many, many, many different protagonists. So it's really different than following a Tony Soprano or a Walter White, this single male white like uber, anti-hero protagonist. Her adaptation does something very different. It invites us into the lives of many, many different women of every age, every gender concept, every race. and all kinds of different walks of life, and pushes forward lots and lots of different stories of lots and lots of different protagonists. That, I think, is why the show has been so incredibly popular. And again, I'm very, very grateful that so many very talented people wanted to come together and make something great. Now, I will say that Halloween has become a pretty weird holiday for me. And that's because people like these nice young ladies who were college students up north, when they tweeted this picture to me, get in touch every Halloween now and are like, for Halloween, I'm going as you. And that's a little meta. But I gotta say, if the result of the show is that more young people, or just people, period, are asking questions or making points more loudly, more prominently in our society, like these young ladies are with their Halloween costume and their signs, I couldn't be more delighted, because it's time for a reckoning in this country about what kind of institutions we want to have. Do we want to have schools? If we really want education for all, there's a direct connection to ending the prison industrial complex and ending the school to prison pipeline, right? We have a choice as a community. We can invest in incredible institutions like this library, right? Or a book festival or a writers festival that happens every year. Like, even though that's not a physical institution, that's still an institution in the community, right? These are the institutions that make places like where we are right now, oops, hold on, I'm ahead of myself, wonderful places to live, and incredible, vibrant places to live. And when we see communities that have what they need in that regard, the institutions that make vibrancy and education and creativity possible, then we see a lot less reliance on prison and jail cells. And when we see communities that don't have those kinds of institutions, or if we see parts of the community that are cut off from those institutions in one way or another, that's when we see an incredible reliance on prisons and jails. I do like to give a little credit to the hero of the piece. This is me, and this is Larry, and this is the day I got out of prison. So I woke up in that awful triangular high-rise that I showed you earlier, and it was a chilly March morning in Chicago, and I had been in prison for 13 months, exactly. And it was supposed to be my release day. I, in fact, did get some time off for good behavior. I am not exactly like Piper Kerman. But you know what? Not a single person in that triangular high-rise had ever spoken a single word to me about my release or my reentry. And in fact, they wouldn't even confirm that they were going to release me. So I was going a little bit cuckoo, to be honest. Despite all that, I woke up, I watched the 6 o'clock news, I watched Martha Stewart get released from prison, a helicopter got her, and I waited. And finally, at 11:30 in the morning, a correctional officer said, "Pack out, Kerman," which means get your crap, you're going somewhere. And they brought me down to receiving and disbursement, which is where every prisoner comes in and every prisoner goes out, just like a warehouse. And they said to me, "We don't have any women's clothes, so here are the smallest men's clothes that we have. Here is a windbreaker. It was Chicago. It was March. And here's $28. This is a gratuity." I was like, "Thank you." What? And they took me down in an elevator to an alleyway door, and a correctional officer opened up the alleyway door and was like, "See ya." And I was 800 miles from my home. And I was just so lucky because this guy was waiting impatiently at the front door of the jail with a plane ticket and some women's clothes to take me home to New York. But what if he hadn't been, right? I think about that literally every day of my life. I think about that because I am grateful to my husband. I think about it when I need to remind myself to be grateful for my husband. And I think about it because I know that there are 700,000 people coming home from prison and jail every year in this country. And I know that not all of them have a Larry who is able to be there right at the gate to make sure that that journey home is a safe one and a successful one. And I want that for them. If there's not a Larry there, I want there to be a community which is ready and willing to create a pathway, because everyone deserves a safe return and a successful return, the opportunity to be successful, right? I sort of made this point already, but when we fail to invest in the amazing things like writers' festivals and libraries and community health centers and arts and daycare centers, that's when we are overly reliant and we're left with no other alternative in theory. So I want to speak quickly. I'll be speaking later this afternoon in more detail about the classes that I teach, but I wanted to touch on them briefly before I open up for questions. And I now teach in 2 state prisons in Ohio. And the reason that that happened is because I was invited in 2013 to attend a TED Talk in a prison, a men's state prison. And I was like, I never heard of such a thing. This picture is from the first TED Talk that was ever held in a women's prison, and this was in Muncie, Pennsylvania. I was there, and women, incarcerated women, were able to get up on the stage, just like I'm standing on the stage right now, and talk about whatever ideas or stories they thought were important to them and important for other people as well. This song is actually, you can look at it, this was a song that was sung by the women who are serving life sentences in that prison. And it was a very intense and emotional moment. I ended up moving to Ohio to teach in that men's prison where I attended that TEDx talk, because I was struck by the warden, I was struck by the men who were living there, I was fascinated by the staff who were living there, because it's not a given that something like that takes place in a setting like a prison or a jail. And I also teach in the main women's prison. It's the same class, so I teach in the men's facility, I teach in the women's facility. The similarities and the differences between the 2 classes are fascinating and wonderful. It's narrative nonfiction writing, creative nonfiction. So my students are telling true stories from their own lives. And I do this work and it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done professionally. Back to one of the things that Gil said when he spoke to you that really resonated with me was this question of being of service. And so the opportunity to go in there and work with my students, almost all of whom earned their GED while they were incarcerated, some of whom are incredibly brilliant and talented writers, given the opportunity to get some of the analytical structure to apply to their stories. Their stories are irresistibly fascinating, heartbreaking, funny, important, right? And that's all I really want, is for each and every one of us, but certainly people who, like me, have felony convictions, to have voice and to be able to tell the stories that we think are important, both for us and for other people to hear. So I'm very grateful to have that opportunity. So this is Shalonda, another of the women that I know from the Women's Prison Association. This is her beautiful family. And this looks like a pretty great day. Look at that smile. For me, this is a great day. I get to be here with all of you. I get to talk about people and issues that I think are important and talk about how that sort of process of storytelling worked for me personally. And I'm so, so grateful for all the good fortune that I've enjoyed. This is a great day for me, right? This is not my worst day, is it? Right? This is not the day I carried that bag of drug money. It's not the day I was sentenced to prison or the day I started doing time, because those were bad days. And what I want for Shalonda and her family, and for each and every one of you, for everybody really, is for us to be recognized not only for our worst days, but for our best days and for the best things we're capable of going forward. And so I really want to thank you for your kind attention. Okay, I'm told that we have 5 minutes for questions, and then we will be also taking questions later this afternoon, so if I don't have time to answer questions then you'll get another bite at the apple. But if we are you a first mover? Yeah, I like a first mover. Come on down.
Hello, Piper. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
My name's John.
Hi, John.
My brush with prison was my dad sold drugs, and he got caught with a couple kilos.
Mm-hmm.
But he was an ex-cop, and he knew the city attorney, so he never saw prison time. So that was.
I'm
my
not
brush.
surprised.
Yeah. So my question is, in the show, there seems to be a lot more men working in the prisons than women, and the men seem juvenile and brutish, but the women seem aloof and kind of bullyish. Can you talk about that?
So, about the depiction in the show. So, it's true that most prisons are staffed primarily by men, and certainly that is true of women's prisons and jails as well. I would make the point that you would be hard-pressed to think of an institution that is more hierarchical, dominance-oriented, an institution that functions based on the premise and the promise of violence than a prison or a jail. They are very patriarchal organizations and entities, right? That's literally how they function. That's part of the construct of prison, right? And so that's true in the first place, and then when you layer sort of the reality of gender imbalances, having all incarcerated women who vastly disproportionately have been victims of sexual abuse and other physical abuse, have substance use disorder issues and mental health issues, and you have a lot of staff who are men who have a lot of power in that setting. You don't necessarily get good behavior, right? Does that sound like a recipe for like the best and the best people we are, showing up every day and bringing our best? Not so much. So that's a reality, right? That is absolutely a reality. In terms of whatever depiction you think about among the women prisoners, prisons are by design places of scarcity and conflict. And scarcity and conflict sometimes bring out the best in us, but a lot of times they bring out the worst in us. And so what I hope is true about the show is that the show is truthful. I get a lot of questions about, is the show realistic? And I'm like, the show is not a documentary and it's not a biopic, thank God. But I believe that the show is truthful and that the themes from the book, themes of race and class and gender and power and friendship and empathy, are the themes that draw people to the show. Because I think those themes are there in every single episode and every single season. So, good question though. Nice to hone in on that gender and power question. Thank you. All right, I think I have time for 2 more questions. Excellent. Hello.
Hi.
What's your name?
Hi, I'm Andy.
Hi, Andy.
Hi. So my question is more about what do you think is your solution to just sort of, I don't know if it's dismantling or just reducing the amount of disproportionate incarcerations and just the lack of, resource. The solution to creating more resources for prisoners once they're released so that they don't go back in eventually.
Yeah. But those are 2 big questions tethered together, right? So one is basically how could we not be the #1 incarcerator in the world? And more practically in the immediate, how can we have more realistic resources for people who are returning home, right? So these systems that we have created in this country are very closely related, right? The public education system, the public health system, the criminal justice system, they overlap to incredible extents, right? So for example, when we think about what happens when a kid leaves school before they have graduated from high school, right? His or her chances of going into the criminal justice system just skyrocketed. So when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, that's a serious thing. When we think about housing instability, or when we think about people not having enough access to health care, it's always some sort of chaos or conflict in one of these really important big areas of people's lives that contribute to the reason that they end up locked up. So, if we simply made rational choices in terms of investing as a community where the need is, then we would see much better results. But we are frankly, I don't know if blinded is the right word, but our judgment is clouded by racism and by white supremacy and by, prejudice against poverty. Father Boyle from Homeboy Industries, which some of you may know about it because it's here in Southern California, said something so profound when he came to Ohio and spoke. He said, "Let us stand in awe of what the poor have to carry rather than in judgment of how they carry it." And so that imbues all of these choices that we make as a community about education or public health or the criminal justice system, right? We don't do what's rational, which is to make sure that people have what they need in the first place. We're one of the richest countries in the world. So that at the front end is, about really substantial tectonic shifts within our country, and it requires an incredible truth and reconciliation system or process around race and white supremacy in this country. In pragmatic terms on reentry, we know that it is those quadrants of like housing, healthcare, being connected to some kind of caring community, whether it's blood family or whether it's a religious community or whatever it is. But people need to have a sense of commitment to others and also have a sense that others are committed to them during that process of return home. And work, work is the number one thing that I hear about from other people, like struggling to get a second chance, just like I got a second chance when I came home and I got a job. Right? So we know that we know exactly actually what will work. We just have to have the will to do it. Yeah, it's not a mystery. It's really about having will and relinquishing, our attachment to white supremacy and our attachment to punishing attitudes towards poor people overwhelmingly. Right? I'm not talking about the easy stuff here, right? I'm talking about the hard stuff. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Hi, last question.
So actually, here's my little. I was also at the TEDx, and I was at the later ones.
Oh, great!
And so I want you to give a big hug to Dan and Wayne if they're
I
still
will.
around.
Dan and Wayne are both in my writing class.
Are they?
These guys were the masterminds of the TEDs.
And
These
I'll
are
tell you,
two incarcerated men.
I was there because I started organizing a TEDx here in San Diego at Donovan Prison.
Oh, okay.
That's the other reoccurring TEDx inside prison.
I know.
So,
I've heard about it from Delia
and Joe D.
And
also
Joe
maybe.
D.
So
They're going to be
thank
excited
you for
that I
sending
saw
that
you.
love back because, and actually for me it was an invitation for the rest of the audience. There's a listening to you reminded me of the Invisibilia episode, and I think you know which one. It's one called Personality Myth.
Yep.
And
which is a podcast, Invisibilia.
Correct.
Yeah.
The Invisibilia podcast. I'm going to face this way because the mic's this way, but
okay.
But it's such an exploration around who we are as human beings and what defines us as human beings and how we become over the course of our life. And the TEDx that Piper alludes to is actually one of the central themes of this podcast, and is a beautiful exploration of our humanity. And so I would invite everyone to explore that, just to take what Piper shared with us today to next level, because it's just another medium and another exploration.
Wonderful. I agree. So just to reiterate, so there's an amazing, so she's connected to the TEDx's that happen here at the prison in Donovan, correct? Yeah. Which is amazing. And it's there are many prisons have done standalone TEDx's, but I think Donovan is the only one that, like Marion, continued to do them, which builds a whole unique culture within the prison in a positive way, a really pro-social way. She's also referencing, for anyone who's just curious about that, but can't necessarily get inside to Donovan to go attend that, there is a podcast called Invisibilia, which did an episode. So if you Google Invisibilia and Marion Correctional Institution, you'll find the podcast. And it's really fascinating for those of you who are curious about that and want to delve a little deeper. Okay, thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Piper Kerman.